Welcome to the third webinar in our Masterclass series for postgraduate students at La Trobe University. Today we're talking about developing your personal brand online and elsewhere. Hi, I'm Barbara Wells and I'm a Careers and Employability Advisor here at La Trobe University. My background includes wide-ranging roles in government and not-for-profit sectors, and also in different education settings. I've also worked as a freelance and a consultant, so I've had a range of experiences of different styles of work and different sectors.
My name's Michael Healy. I'm a Careers and Employability Advisor at La Trobe University. I have about 10 years of experience in higher education, teaching language, teaching academic skills, and in student services such as career development. I've recently started a doctorate in education, focusing on career development education, and in particular looking at how professional identities are formed and articulated.
In earlier webinars in this series, we've looked at the idea of career planning as an ongoing process, a flexible approach that's far more realistic and effective than trying to design and follow a set, rigid career plan. We've also discussed the notion that career options will be driven by your own story and your particular motivations, as well as external forces beyond your control. There's also the idea that your ideas about careers and goals will need to be reality checked, based on research and strategy, but also through just trying things out, taking some risks and being open to unexpected opportunities and outcomes. Really, it's all about lifelong learning. Following on from this, we looked at the idea of employability as a way of thinking and behaving, or a mindset. This view of employability has three dimensions: career identity, personal adaptability, and your social and human capital. In a competitive marketplace, it's essential to have an employability mindset. If you're going to translate your uni qualifications into paid work and continue developing your career. So today we're talking about the concept of developing your personal brand, online and elsewhere, as a way of fostering employability, not just around creating and putting forward a career identity, but also as a way of building your personal adaptability and your social and human capital. There's a lot of talk around what we should be doing with our careers, and personal branding is part of that conversation. Michael and I were wondering what it actually means. What is a personal brand? So brands are all around us in everyday life, in our daily choices, our affiliations and our loyalties. And obviously different brands have different associations. So think about where you buy your weekly groceries. It goes beyond a logo, and we connect with what we identify with what we value. So what words and feelings spring to mind when you think of Woolworths, IGA, Coles, Aldi?
And similarly, the notion of brand also extends to people, particularly people in the public domain, for better or for worse. Think of the political sphere. What are different public figures known for, and what will they be remembered for?
And what about in your career domain? What are employers and colleagues going to know you for? What will they remember you for? So this brings us to the idea of having a personal brand and how you might manage yours. Not everyone's comfortable with the concept of being a brand. Some other ways to look at it might be around what makes you unique, what you feel passionate about, what you see as your vocation, your profession, your calling, maybe even your mission. So there are lots of ways to look at it. What do you think about the concept of being a brand?
Well,
Michael?
I think I agree with you, Barbara, that I'm pretty uncomfortable with that idea of branding in the very corporate sense, the marketing sense, and you see a lot of people around making a big effort to brand themselves, and it comes across as very artificial. So I agree with you, it's a lot more personal than that, and I think it comes down to those things you mentioned about your passion, your vocation. Often when I talk to students here, I talk to them about telling people why they've done what they've done, not just what they've done, but why have they made those decisions that have taken them to those places. And from that, I think a lot of purpose and meaning comes from that.
So it's not just about the surface of things, it's the stories people have to tell and what makes them unique.
Yeah, stories is a great word, and I think we'll be talking about that a bit more in the presentation, because branding really is about telling your story, isn't it?
I think it's very much about having an identity, and how you play that out has to be consistent with how you see yourself. So for myself, I like to keep a quite strong delineation between my personal life and my professional life. Personally, I actually don't do social media. I engage in different ways with my family and my friends and people I connect with.
Yeah, that's very important, because, you know, as we discussed earlier, I'm a bit more engaged with social media, and the boundary between my personal and professional life is perhaps a little less distinct than in your case. So everybody has to make that decision about where they're going to draw certain boundaries and what they're going to do to engage with things. And we're not suggesting that everybody has to do it one way or the other, but what we are suggesting, I think, is that people do need to pause and consider what's best for them and how they're going to manage things.
Yeah, definitely. And being purposeful in what you do.
Absolutely.
So you're owning what you're doing. You're not just doing it because everyone else is.
Yeah, that's right. And we'll be talking about that as we get into more detail about particular things that people can do.
So what do you want to be known for? Think about it. What do you know about? What sort of expertise would you like to be known for?
What are you good at? What are your skills and what are your strengths?
What are you able to produce or create for an organisation or for your clients?
What are you currently doing?
And what do you like to work with?
What motivates you? What are your values?
And how can you connect and collaborate with others?
And where can you develop and communicate your brand, value, and uniqueness for other people?
Your professional online self begins with having an online presence, but it's action that creates your career identity and reputation, and trust that is developed from there, whether in face-to-face interactions or what you do online. The truth about your online profile, yourself, your brand, is that it already exists. And you already have an online brand. Where is it? Is it on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram? And how does it look? How can you give it a makeover, develop it, craft it, curate it, develop it? And who do you want to see it?
I really like this perspective from Liz Ryan, because it's a reminder that our brand comes from simply being a person in our community. We're known by our friends and our family, our co-workers, our neighbours. The way we behave, the way we act, what we perform, that's what gives us our personal brand. It's important to realise this, because there are many people that don't feel that they really want to develop a personal brand, but it's important to recognise that we have to take that agency, because it's there whether we work on it or not. I think it's worth pointing out that not having any presence online is still a personal brand, and it's not a very good one. People expect to find some trace of you somewhere online. We can contrast this with people who have integrated their entire being with their online behaviours. We see them in social media and mainstream media, and we know that there's a very thin line between who they are in public and who they are online. The good news is that there's a wide spectrum of positions in between there that you can engage in on your terms. Barbara and I have been talking about where we sit on the spectrum. I'm a much more active user of social media and online platforms, whereas Barbara is perhaps less so.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I probably sit somewhere between passive and active, depending on what my purpose is. So I've had a LinkedIn profile, for instance, for about 10 years, maybe even a bit more. And I'm active with that when I need to be, as far as building connections, if I'm looking for recommendations, if I'm documenting projects I've worked on. But I'm also finding that it's actually been a really good way to track and connect to my career across different organisations and people. So for me, it's very much a tool, and I like to set the terms for how I use that.
Yeah, and a lot of people do that. They'll set up a LinkedIn profile, for example, and they'll populate it and they'll maintain it. But that's sort of where it ends, and they're not necessarily, posting things on there or engaging in conversations, and that's fine. it's all about what purpose, like you said, the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, and that's what it really comes down to. I'm reluctant to always recommend that people go beyond their comfort zone, because when they do that, you can see it, and it's no longer authentic, and it's, people should be doing what they do because they really see some meaning in it, and not because they're trying to develop their online brand or secure work or something like that.
I think that authenticity is important though in that as well. I suppose a parallel I would give is around blogging. So a lot of people go, "Oh, start a blog, that would be a good thing to do." Well, starting a blog is a good idea if you're a good writer and you've got good ideas and you understand your niche. But if you're not a great writer and you don't understand how to write for an online audience and you don't really know your topic or your area of expertise, it's not a good use of that medium.
Yeah,
so,
and there's also nothing worse than finding a new blog and then realising that they haven't updated it since 2012. It sort of doesn't leave a good impression. So that's a good example of how, if you're going to do something like that, you really need to commit to it, put some resources behind it, and be very intentional and very organised and strategic about it.
That said, on the continuum, I suppose in terms of consuming social media, I actually do quite a bit of that. So there are a range of things that I follow and look at, but I just don't engage in that dialogue. And I also feel a bit guilty that I don't do more. I know that there's potential, there's things that I could develop. Some of it's just about time.
Oh, that's the thing, isn't it? You can't do everything. And I think in this presentation we're going to talk about a range of strategies that people can use. And the idea is you don't have to do them all. You can pick and choose what works with you and what sits well with the way that you want to engage online.
Let's begin by talking about first impressions. And online photos are a really good example of this. I mean, the simple one being obviously if you've got crazy party photos of yourself on Facebook, it's not a good look when it comes to recruiters or employers looking at your online presence. We've just got a selection of images here from LinkedIn. And I guess it's interesting just to kind of look at these different faces and consider questions of trust. When you look at these faces, would you trust this person to manage your money? Would you trust this person to hire the right people for your organisation? To lead and inspire others? To come up with creative ideas? To keep confidential information? And employers are making that judgment on first impressions about what kind of job we're going to do for them and for their clients. And a lot of that actually does come down to first impressions and to that notion of responsibility and being trustworthy and accountable and delivering on promises, like Michael was saying earlier. So let's rewind for a minute back to those three dimensions of employability: career identity, personal adaptability, and social and human capital. So how can your professional reputation or brand, online or in your daily interactions, help you to develop your career identity? So we've just looked at images online, and that gives a sense at that first level and a surface level of career identity: who you are, how you present, how you might interact with others, and where you position yourself.
We're also looking at personal adaptability as one of those three dimensions of employability. And this is simply about change, really, changing yourself and coping with external change as well. So we're talking about things like lifelong learning, making things happen, taking an active and strategic approach, exercising initiative and leadership, and tapping into trends and networks, being able to identify them in the first place, but also take advantage of them. And then also coping with challenges where things may not go your way, having the adaptability to roll with it.
So Michael, would you see a connection with that and what people can do online in terms of using online platforms for their lifelong learning, to build connections?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so many ways that you can engage with information and learn gain information, learn new skills, exercise new skills. I see a lot of room in digital media and social media for using adaptability, because it opens you up to such a range of opportunities and experiences.
So from an employer perspective, or in terms of collaborators or colleagues or even business partners, engaging in that domain and having those adaptable qualities speaks well to employers, but it also skills you up for a whole lot of things that are useful in developing
Absolutely, and it's amazing how quickly things start to coalesce. So you start sending sort of messages out into the internet, and people notice, and they'll come back to you with new information, with resources, with ideas, or simply with encouragement, which is a big part of this whole thing.
Yeah, that makes me think of involvement through meetups. So I was involved with a couple of professional groups through meetups, which happens online, but then you meet in person, and that space was very much about all of the things in that middle domain around adaptability and sharing information and ideas, really.
Yeah.
And that leads quite well into the idea of social and human capital. So very much the notion of building your networks, which is very much something you can do online, putting across your education, your skills, your technical knowledge and expertise, and your demographics in terms of those things that are defining elements of you. Earlier on in this webinar series, we talked about people's motivations for doing postgraduate study. And career development and advancement is a main motivation of most postgrad students. So thinking about your main career focus just now, where are you at? What's the most important thing for you? Is it about gaining a broader context or a sense of the bigger picture?
Or are you trying to acquire a deeper, more expert knowledge?
Is part of your study journey at the moment about developing a specialisation, something you're going to become known for, a niche?
You could be augmenting your professional role with some relevant formal learning in order to perform better at work and to enrich your work.
Well, maybe you want to get a competitive edge in the labour market, maybe in the current organisation you work for, in another, as far as perhaps moving up.
You could be meeting industry requirements, sort of baseline qualifications or accreditations.
Or you could be positioning yourself for higher responsibilities and a better salary.
Yep, and quite simply building networks. Perhaps you're moving into a new industry or moving location, and you need to strengthen your professional networks.
So the question here is, thinking about your main career focus, what kinds of online platforms could you be using to progress in this area? Yeah,
there's no one platform that's going to do everything for you. It's about choosing the right tool for the right job.
And having a focus on not trying to do everything all at one time.
Yeah, absolutely. So Barbara and I have been talking a bit about the theory of, or our understanding and our conceptions of, what makes a personal brand. We're now going to turn to more practical matters and talk about specific tools and techniques that you can use to shape your brand online. The first is obviously you need to pause and do a bit of reflection. Before you do any action online, just stop and think about what it is that you want your brand to say. How are you going to shape it? What is the key message that you want to share?
You also want to be planning how you're going to craft and promote your brand. Maybe even looking at how people with something similar are going about this. So not starting from scratch and not going in green.
So once you've got an idea of what it is that you want to say and how you're going to say it, then it's time to take action and deliver your message to your audience. Now, it's really important to remember that this isn't a once-off thing. You don't just launch it out into the world and then it does its own work. These activities are really sort of day-to-day life, part of engaging in your professional community, performing in your workplace. It's something that you sort of have to make part of your daily workflow. So for different kinds of strategies of ways to work online in terms of your personal brand, we're going to use the 7 C's of digital career literacy, which comes from Longridge, Hooley and Staunton. Now Tristram Hooley, one of the authors here, he's a leader in career education, isn't he?
He's a bit of a guru.
Bit of a guru. He works at the University of Derby in the UK, and he's recently released a book with Jim Bright all about getting a job online. So he's one of the first people to really start writing about the potential for digital media, online media, as a career development tool. So quite early on in the piece, he came up with the 7 C's: changing, collecting, critiquing, connecting, communicating, creating and curating. It's nice to have that alliteration in there. We're going to go through one by one with some specific examples of what you can do for each thing. Now remember that the point of this is that you're not really necessarily expected to do all of them. It's about choosing the ones that are the most useful for you in this time and this place for the purpose that we discussed earlier. So the first C is changing, and that refers to changing yourself, basically developing yourself. How do you go from being a novice to an expert? How do you expand your realm of domain knowledge or your set of skills? So something that comes to mind is online learning, and this can be, again, ranging from very formal programs such as degrees. You know, people these days are doing their bachelor degrees entirely online, through to fairly informal things like social learning networks, Twitter and Facebook, for example, and things like MOOCs or online learning. The example I've given here is lynda.com, which is, I think, owned by LinkedIn now. It's integrated with LinkedIn, and it's great. It's just little chunks of knowledge that you can sign up and develop your skills.
It's also a great way just to get a taster. If you're thinking that you might be interested in something, you can just have a little try, and especially if you're doing this through a MOOC, they're free. So it's really just about an investment of your time to get a taste for something and see if you want to build up.
Yeah.
But it might also be about complementing something you're doing in your uni course where you want to get a bit of an edge, or there's a specialisation that's not really covered in your course where you can just get that edge.
Yeah, there's a great social component of these as well. So when you sign up to these, you're generally introduced to, you know, people all around the world who have that same interests with you, and it's quite common to set up Facebook groups or LinkedIn groups where you can exchange ideas. A good example is the Doctorate of Education I'm doing. I realise that there's a few people around the world doing something similar, but we're fairly dispersed. So simply setting up a LinkedIn group gives us a place that we can sort of share ideas and encourage each other, and that's been really useful.
So you're really creating a community.
Creating a community, so yeah, you're changing yourself, but also in this sort of social sense. So another C is collecting, and I've got two ways of thinking about this actually. The first one is in the sense of documents and files and things like that. I mean, we're moving to a paperless society, so we're talking a lot about the cloud. We've got Google Documents, Dropbox, or I'm sure there's thousands of others. So part of it is being able to organise and secure your information. I think that's important as well. I mean, we do need to consider issues of security when we're talking about online engagement.
So how do you manage that?
I'm not sure that I do. To be honest, I do use a password manager.
Yeah.
So I have a password manager that actually stores my passwords. I remember one password, and then that stores all of my other passwords.
Okay.
So these passwords are very long, very complicated. I don't have to remember them. And you can also use things like authentication, where they send a message to your phone and things like that. I do use that for Dropbox. But collecting obviously is pretty big. Now that we're storing things and syncing them, you do need to have those skills. But the other side of collecting really is also just collecting bookmarks and collecting sources of information. So I use an RSS feed, a reader, so rather than visiting dozens of different blogs or websites to see what they've updated, I put them into my feed reader, and then every morning I can just check that and it's automatically all updated. I find that really useful for keeping up with really important sort of voices in my professional community. And then also saving resources as bookmarks, you know, because I think we all have that challenge of finding something, it's really useful, but then we forget how we found it, you know.
So the next C is about critiquing, and this has got two levels to it.
Yes, it does.
The first is about having a critical mind and looking at the information you're getting online, because anyone can put stuff up online.
Yeah, I think we all know, you know, the dangers of online information and just how much bias can creep in there and how unreliable it can be. So it is important to have that, you know, level of cynicism or skepticism when it comes to online media and being able to critique the information that comes in.
We're in interesting times in terms of people being able to position themselves as experts, and even if you think about the offline world and the topic of careers, everyone's got career advice.
Oh, that's right.
That doesn't mean it's expert career advice or it's up to date. So, for example, in my family, I would be, if I was looking for career advice, I probably wouldn't be talking to my parents, not because they're not good, intelligent people, but because their experience generationally is very different to the way things are going now. There might be specific aspects of career management that I would ask them about or have conversation about, but in terms of getting specific information, you need to go to the expert current source on that, not just someone who started a blog and thinks they know everything about.
Yeah, you're
X,
absolutely
Y,
right.
Z.
And it can be very difficult sometimes to tell the difference because of how easy it is to set up a website that looks very professional, very credible, and put anything you want on there. Another element of critiquing, I think, is also, sharing your critique. So we're talking about maybe engaging with discussions around policy or professional, questions of practice and so forth. Every field has its controversies, has its debates, has its different ways of operating, and so it's quite useful sometimes to put your voice into the mix. A good example is the conversation.com.au. This is where a range of academics and people in the public and private sector are able to share their articles, discussing the issues of the day and sharing their perspective and engaging in a bit of a discourse around that. Really useful, and I think at the level of, we're talking to people at postgraduate level, people expect you to have an opinion. They want you to often take a stance, take a position, and it's important to sort of back yourself sometimes.
But what about the lifetime of that critique and knowing what you're talking about? What's the kind of line between an argument for an argument's sake or getting out there into the discussions because you feel like you should be in the discussion?
We do have to be careful, of course, of how we manage those discussions and how critical our critiques are. So, and it is easy to find yourself, blowing off steam online sometimes, so it's something to be mindful about. You do see this on LinkedIn sometimes where politics creeps into it. And of course everybody's political, but there are people sometimes going overboard. So if you need to develop that filter, I think, and make sure that when you're critiquing, when you're sharing your opinions and your perspective, that you're doing so in a fairly robust intellectual way, with attention to good source material, just the way that you express yourself.
Do you think this is a good arena where it's worthwhile observing and really getting a handle around sort of the commentators whose perspectives and way of debating and putting ideas out you admire and find has integrity?
It's often good to get the lay of the land first before jumping in there and causing waves. You never know who's going to be seeing your input, and you need to know that you're not shooting yourself in the foot, I guess. Obviously, one of the great advantages of online media is being able to connect with people. We are living in a very digitally connected age. Facebook, I think, is, what do they say? It's the largest country by population on Earth. So obviously, finding and maintaining connections with people is one of the great advantages of the internet. Obviously, LinkedIn.com is the name for professional networking like this, but Facebook, Twitter, any of those platforms, they're going to do the same job. We're going to talk more about connecting as well, because it's important not to just keep it online. I think that's one of the big mistakes is people accumulate lots of online contacts, but if you don't ever make anything of that, it's not really going to prove beneficial. So the online space has revolutionised communicating, and we probably all wish that it hadn't sometimes, given the amount of time that we spend in email. But obviously there's certain skills around that those new forms of communication, and there are new ones emerging as well all the time. But communicating isn't just the official internal communications like emails and getting business done. It's also about broadcasting. So Twitter's a good example of this. I'm able to communicate with quite a lot of people simply by updating my Twitter account, and that's really useful because it allows me to share my opinions or to share some interesting news or interesting resources with a whole bunch of people that might be interested in that. Creating is a big part of online branding as well, because these days it's so easy for someone to make images, to make videos, to record their voice like we're doing now. The barriers for creation have really been reduced. This is an example. YouTube, of course, you can go on YouTube and find any number of people speaking to a camera on any number of topics. So if you're an expert in a field, it's a great way to share that expertise. Blogging is another example. If it's visual, Instagram might be your place, but there's lots of range for creative expression and producing things.
And what you want to make sure is that perhaps the media that you're using to create and the level of it is consistent with that career identity that you want to put across, consistent with your strengths, consistent with your skill set, and that it's congruent with the sort of occupation and profile that you're trying to align yourself with.
So that's a polite way of saying it's got to be good.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true. There's lots of people that they try and do it on the cheap, or they knock something off quickly, and you need a certain degree of polish. I mean, authenticity counts for a lot, but you need to be heard, so that pay attention to the audio quality and things like that. And this is a great way to upskill as well. If you think this is something that you want to get into, there's a range of resources. We went back to that first point about changing and learning new skills. There's so many ways to learn these technologies and these techniques. And the final of the 7 C's is curating. And I'm going to pass it over to Barbara, because Barbara actually has a background in museum studies. So what does curating mean to you?
Okay, so I was never a curator, but when I think about the notion of curating, and have worked with curators, it's about basically being able to organise and interpret stuff with a particular audience in mind. So curating is about being selective. It's not just about throwing stuff in because it feels like it's the right thing. It's about thinking about information and ideas and the context in which they're communicating to other people, and also thinking about who you're actually communicating to. So the way that I might curate a website for students here at La Trobe at an undergraduate level would be quite different to the way perhaps I might curate something for high school students thinking about coming to university and having those first thoughts about coming to uni, and different again curating for parents trying to support their kids making career decisions about coming to uni.
Yeah, it's about investing your effort into prioritising and shining a light on those things that you want to be shown. And so that draws us to this point about Googling yourself. People often talk about, in terms of a personal brand, a good test would be to Google your name. And most people would have to include a bit of extra information for it to be found from all the other people with that name. But we've got the example of our manager, Jason Brown, here, and he's done a pretty good job, I think, of curating the different areas where he engages online and investing his effort so that he knows that those things are going to show first in Google's rankings. I think Jason understands a little bit about how Google works, and so he's able to make sure that he's giving some visibility to things that he thinks is important.
Is this where we're sort of also thinking about optimising your online information and the sort of metadata that you're using?
Yeah, you do have to be attentive to that, particularly if you're blogging and using those keywords and Google search engine optimization and so forth. If you're not at that level, I mean, simply LinkedIn's a good example here. You can be fairly confident that if you populate LinkedIn in the way that it encourages you to do, it's going to do that job for you, and that's going to most likely rise towards the top.
So what you're saying is you could leverage off particular platforms to do that?
Yeah, and understanding the settings. So if you're not careful, your Facebook could start coming up in the rankings as well.
Okay.
If you're not careful about sort of shutting that down and keeping that in a bit of a closed space, if that's what you want to do.
So if people aren't experts in this area, is this somewhere where they can be building their networks?
Oh, definitely. It's worth asking people, and it's also sometimes worth asking people, how did you find me, or what did you notice about me, and sometimes Googling from another computer and things like that because of the way things work. Trying to see yourself through other people's eyes, perhaps.
Market research.
Exactly. So for me, curating sort of means taking your engagement in any number of social media platforms or online platforms and arranging them or coordinating them in a way. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got to have a presence on all of them, but it does mean that you've got to be attentive of how they work together, because these days nothing is sort of an island on its own. An example might be that if you're filming YouTube videos, you're going to publish them perhaps on your WordPress blog, and then you're going to tweet it, and you're going to put it on Facebook, and maybe update LinkedIn when you've got a new video up. So it's important to think of how all of these platforms are going to work together. So the particular platform that everyone thinks of when we talk about professional branding is LinkedIn. So I think we'll go into a little bit more detail about some aspects of LinkedIn that can be useful. I'm going to highlight 6 different things that you can do on LinkedIn. We're not going to be comprehensive. I'm just choosing a couple of quite powerful functions on LinkedIn, and I'm sort of adapting or drawing from this ebook, which you can download from LinkedIn's website, 6 Steps to Building Your Recruiter Brand on LinkedIn.
So we've already touched on first impressions and the role of photos online. So you want to choose a photo that looks like you, not like a version of you or you 15 years ago or you 10 years ago or you when you were out partying.
It is quite funny sometimes you meet someone in person and you don't recognise them from their LinkedIn profile, so yeah.
It's a bit weird. You also need to make sure that your face takes up at least 60% of the frame. So we don't need to see a full view of your garden or your office space. And we don't want to see half of somebody in the frame who's kind of been chopped out.
Don't take a group photo and crop
look.
it. That's pretty awful. We've seen, a corner of someone's face. It's disrespectful to them for a start.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bad look, isn't it? You also want to have the right expression. So a smile, but not a grin. Wearing what you'd wear to work, so you do need to look professional and not like you could potentially not have a top on. And you want to choose a background that's not too distracting, so something quite neutral. And these examples up here are all really good examples of people look like humans. They look friendly, they look professional, they look well dressed, and I think they look pretty trustworthy. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say so. So the second key thing to think about is the headline, and the headline is, I think it's 120 characters that appears underneath your name on LinkedIn. And this is important because this is one of the only things that, aside from your name and your photo, it's the only thing people are going to see everywhere on LinkedIn. So before they even click on your profile, anytime there's a notification or an update, they're going to see these words.
So obviously, packs as much punch as a tweet.
Absolutely, you've got to really think about it like that. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make is just to put their job title in there, which obviously it's sort of truthful and you may think that that's reasonable, but you're missing a really big opportunity if you do that. Because the fact is most people's job title doesn't actually express the meaning that they draw from their work.
So it presents a more rounded picture of who someone is and what their skill set is, do you reckon? They're in their interests?
Yeah, quite possibly it does. And it's important to sort of think about it and be quite intentional about it. So here's a couple of examples. Adrian uses, sort of a bit of a story or a bit of value. He's talking about creating economic opportunity. Jill, I quite like Jill's. She's using kind of like a little bit of a teaser, a bit of clickbait really. What does that mean? We want to know more about what's happening. Well, we all know Airbnb now, I guess, but perhaps back when, she was onto something there. And I've put my example in there because I'm a big fan of using those little dividing lines, because I took the keyword approach. Now, none of these words in mine actually refer to my job title, but these are the things that I want to be, or the things that I think people might sort of understand.
They also reflect what you do, though. That you're about career development, that you consult, and that you're also studying.
Yeah, so I wanted to express that to show that I'm fairly academically engaged in my profession. The careers consultant part of it, that's not something I call myself, but it's pretty much, I guess, the typical word that people would use. So I've put that in there for recognition, and then the career development educator, that's actually the part important to me. So if someone's going to click on your profile, the first thing they're going to want to look at is the summary. So after the picture and the headline, this is really the fundamental thing. In fact, most people aren't going to read much of your profile other than the summary. I guess the biggest advice we want to talk about here is to try and avoid some of those buzzwords and cliches which make people roll their eyes. LinkedIn's actually done some research and published the top 10 global buzzwords, which they recommend that not that you don't use them at all, but that you're very careful about how you use them.
Okay, so if someone is actually creative, how would they use their creative skills to actually convey that without being too cliched?
Well, look, I think what it comes down to is that it's easy to state something. Anyone can write that they're creative. So what you're really looking for is how are you going to demonstrate that you're creative? What evidence are you going to provide for that? So one thing you can do is to describe instances in which you've used your creativity. I think the far better way, and I'll show you later on how you can do this is to actually use LinkedIn as a bit of a portfolio. So instead of just talking about it, you actually show people the proof is in the pudding. So here's the quality of my work.
Okay.
So I'm going to go back to Liz Ryan again, and something I like about Liz Ryan is she often talks about using the human voice in resumes and cover letters and on LinkedIn. And what she means by using the human voice is using full sentences, using the first person, and using kind of simple, plain and approachable language. I like how she talks about telling your story, not dressing it up in sort of corporate buzzwords and trying to have high impact jargon, but just saying things in an approachable way so that people understand what you're all about.
So it comes back to authenticity, really, doesn't it? And showing people who you are and who you genuinely are.
To get a bit more specific about the summary, I quite like this article that talks about 5 different summary templates or types. Some people use their summary to talk a lot about their mission or their sense of purpose in what they do. Some people express a lot about their personality. The short and sweet summary is kind of functional. It's describes your experience and your key skills. The accomplishment summary obviously is a bit of a boasting sheet. All the great things you've done. And then, there's the blended summary where you might draw aspects of each one into what works for you. I like this because it shows just how versatile that little section can be. It doesn't have to be the same as everybody else is doing it. You're allowed to take your own position. Something that you can do on LinkedIn is to actually specify particular projects that you've worked on. So in addition to listing your positions in terms of your work experience, you can actually isolate particular projects that you're proud of or that demonstrate certain skills. So I've got an example of a workbook that I wrote, which I'm particularly proud of. And it's great to be able to sort of extract that and shine a light on it to highlight a deliverable that you've actually been able to put together.
Okay, so employers don't just want to know about what you can do, they want to know with what you can do with what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially you're being paid to deliver a product or a service, and being able to talk about projects on your LinkedIn profile is evidence that you've done something like that in the past and you could do something similar to that in the future.
Definitely. And look, I think as we get to more towards the way that careers are working these days, more of a portfolio career where people might not necessarily be employed long term and on a continuous basis, and they're probably hopping from project to project. So certainly for people like consultants, using this project lens might actually be more fruitful than thinking of an employment lens.
Yep, so you can pivot around kind of core skills you've got, and that's certainly how I developed my career in the arts sector, around sort of 3 or 4 different skill sets, and then adapting them to different projects where there was money to pay people.
Exactly,
basically.
And it's a great way to leverage sort of opportunities that you get to work on particular projects where your job title might have, maybe projects sort of outstrip your position per se, so it's a chance for you to leverage the projects really well for the next step. So obviously being online, LinkedIn allows you to actually embed media and to share links to anywhere on the internet. So it allows you to treat it a little bit like a portfolio. You're not just describing your experience and your skills, but you're actually able to share examples of the work that you've done. So I've taken our manager Jason Brown, he's done a couple of presentations on different aspects of his work, and he's shared them at conferences and in the professional bodies. So he's gone along and he's embedded the PowerPoint presentations into his summary. So people can not only sort of read about what he does, but they can actually see sort of evidence of the work that he's doing.
So this makes a good case study for our presentation today, but it also reflects a tried and trusted principle of good writing, which is show, don't tell. So rather than telling people about what you've done and what you can do, this is a great way to be able to show them.
Yeah, that's right. And often if I'm looking at someone's resume and they talk about, I created a website or I gave a presentation or something, then in this day and age, it's sort of like, well, show me, provide the link and give me the evidence, and I'll be the judge of whether it's any good or not.
Yeah, hyperlinks are a great way to do that. Do you put them in your resume?
I do, because I figure most people are going to be reading it online, so and it's there for them to use if they choose to. I don't think they always will, but it's nice to put it in there. I think it just makes it looks nice as well. It's a chance to get some greater depth, in terms of what you've actually been able to put together.
Yeah.
So one of the three facets of employability that we spoke about was human and social capital. And so the human capital is your skills, it's the qualities that you have, and then the social capital is sort of how people value that, I guess. And LinkedIn's got two functions that is quite good for sharing this, and the first is endorsements. So when you set up your LinkedIn profile, you can actually populate a field with particular skills that you have and that are valuable to you. And then LinkedIn pesters other people to endorse it or not.
It's a funny aspect of LinkedIn, isn't it?
It is a little weird because you log in and it'll say things like, "Is Barbara good at public speaking?" And often you don't actually know. And I think most people sometimes press yes whether they actually know or not. I've sometimes had, so and so has endorsed you for public speaking, and I think, well, I've never actually met that person, so they've never seen me speak in public. I do think on aggregate, in the bigger scheme of things, your actual skills will rise to the top, because enough people do actually know about you, and that's certainly the case with the ones that I've shared here. Something worth managing is that you can curate this. We were talking about curating earlier, so I was very careful and very intentional about which skills I'm listing. If I decided that any of those were not reflective of who I wanted to be right now, I could suppress it. So not delete it, but I can mean that I can make it so that it's not on that list anymore.
Yeah, so it's not visible, but it's behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's behind the scenes. And the great thing about these is that they're not just showing other people those skills or how other people rank me or whatever. They're sort of keywords, they're search terms, and they form part of that data that LinkedIn uses to create connections, to find me when someone searches for certain things. So it is actually a pretty useful and pretty important part of it.
I really like the recommendations feature of LinkedIn, and I've used that a bit over the years, partly as a record keeping way of tracking work that I've done and feedback from people, and they're more or less testimonials. Something I really like about LinkedIn is the capacity to get recommendations from people. For me, particularly when I worked in the arts sector, it was a great way of documenting different projects that I'd done, and rather than saying I did this, I did that, getting authentic and credible third person who thought my work was good enough to pay me and keep me on, to actually provide an account of what I did and what I was like to work with, so that my career identity is actually being reinforced by credible sources.
This is the modern equivalent of the old reference letter, isn't it, really? When you leave a job, you got someone to type up a letter, and this is sort of what happens here.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting that you can be strategic about this as well. So, Eric Asado there, he provided a reference for me. We actually did that as an exchange. So he emailed me once and said, "Hey, how about we recommend each other?" And we even gave each other some talking points, which, some people might say is a little bit cheeky, but, we were honest and we stand by it because we're actually sharing our social capital. You're sharing, when you make a recommendation, you're sharing a little bit of your reputation with that person.
Oh, definitely. And I think that applies as well to the connections you make. And that's something I wanted to ask you about, because you do get a range of requests from people to connect. And I think that's a matter of personal policy about how far you extend that out.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I've, I met a lot of people with different perspectives on that. And, some people very closed. And LinkedIn does have this sort of jargon of closed networker and open networker. I sit somewhere in the middle. I don't have to necessarily have met that person, but I do expect to see some clear reason why we would have a professional relationship.
Yep, I'm the same.
So LinkedIn's good, not just because it's an online resume. A lot of people think it's kind of limited to that, or connecting with people and like a sort of digital business card sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's actually really a useful platform for creating, critiquing and communicating as well, and I think a lot of people don't really realise just how useful it is in that respect. So if you don't want to or don't really have the capacity to set up your own blog, LinkedIn's a pretty good blogging platform. And so it's really easy for a start to write your article. It takes care of the formatting and the hosting for you. But you can also have a pretty strong impact. So I've included there Farouk Day, who is the Director of Career Education at Stanford University, and he wrote an article called The 10 Future Trends in College Career Services.
Okay.
So on one hand, this is just a LinkedIn article,
Yep.
but on the other hand, that had a pretty significant impact. So, I've seen that reference quite a lot, and it's helped, a lot of people talk about it as sort of the future of career services. So there's an example of just publishing something on LinkedIn. It's not this, it's very easy, very straightforward for him to do, but he had a huge reach and it made a huge impact on it.
And a huge reach to his community, right?
That's
to
right.
his peers globally.
Yeah. So, he's contributing to his professional field, and then the added advantage is that he's setting himself, as a bit of a thought leader, as someone who's, thinking about the cutting edge.
Yeah.
But even again, if you're not really into writing an article and you don't want to engage at that level, simply sharing and commenting and liking and doing all those sort of Facebooky things on LinkedIn can be quite good, because it does signal to the world about what you find interesting and what you find important. I use LinkedIn every day. I visit it every day, and I like and I share and I comment every day. I use it probably as much as I do use Facebook.
Yeah. So it really is that for different personalities and different styles, as well as different purposes, there are different ways to use this as a tool. So you might have some people that prefer to see themselves as facilitators, who might be sharing information like this and providing that commentary, where someone else who's establishing their niche and their area of expertise, like the Stanford professor we were just speaking about, that's a way of actually reinforcing that. So this is also about career identity in a way, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is about career identity, and people notice it. So I'll talk a little bit later about making those human connections, and people. I've had many experiences where people have noticed the kind of things I engage in on LinkedIn, and that helps them realise that I am someone that they should talk to, to exchange with, and that we have a common interest, or that I could share something with them, or they could, teach me something.
Yeah. So although we can think about branding that might seem at a superficial level just about the surface of things, when you look at these other dimensions of what you can do, it's really a way of getting below the surface and showing those other facets to your interests and your areas of knowledge and the stuff that you know about, and people can opt into that information.
Absolutely, and you can still be fairly intentional about this as well. So I studied history at university, and at one point considered myself a historian. But I don't really engage with a lot of historical discussion on LinkedIn, because I think it would cloud sort of the perspective that I want people to know about me. I think it might, not that it would harm my personal brand, but I just want it to be fairly cohesive, and so I don't want to muddy the water too much. So I talk about history in other places, with other people. So it is still, even if it's just at the level of liking an article, it's still something that every time you do that, you're sending a signal of some sort. You can harness that.
Yeah, there's something else there though too, which is about transferable skills. And although that background in being able to research, in critical thinking, in debate, in putting together a cogent argument, all of that brings to bear on the work that you do now. And although it's not on the surface of things part of your identity, it's actually perhaps part of your approach and your core skill set, which is adding value to what you do, but it's not, you're not branding yourself as such.
No, that's right. It's still there, but it's part of that whole. It's and it's quite interesting how these disparate things come together sometimes. Yeah. You don't even realise that it's happening until someone points it out to you.
Yeah. So as we've seen, there's all this incredible potential online around developing your career identity and positioning yourself for work and collaborations and business partnerships, and showing people a much fuller picture of who you are. It's not just about the surface level of your online photo on LinkedIn. But what's really important here is to consider that networking still comes down to actually connecting with others. Building connections, following up, meeting up for a coffee, actually working together on projects, whether that's partly done in the virtual world or by actually working together side by side in a workplace or a work cooperative space or wherever. And essentially, even though we think about networking as something for the long term, building those connections and sharing information, it's also really about making things happen. Because when you look at most initiatives, they're not done by people on their own. Even when you have people who are spearheading a particular area of expertise, there's always people sort of behind them, backing them up. But we're also looking at really exciting new collaborative models, and I think that's something that's really opened up online.
Oh, absolutely. Finding people to work with is fantastic. Like I mentioned earlier, the group that I set up for the doctoral researchers in career education. I mean, that would have been a mailing list 25 years ago, but now it's right there on my phone. Even when I'm on the tram, I can talk to this person in Denver, Colorado, who's working in an area similar to mine, and we can exchange PDFs and we can exchange ideas and encouragement, and that's pretty powerful.
Definitely. So, and it's about that lifelong learning still, and taking things to kind of the next level.
Absolutely.
So it's about thinking about the online space as a tool, but it's actually reflective of those broader work principles, I suppose, around how you communicate with people, how you work together, how communication is a two-way thing, not just putting out your messages. It's also about listening, critiquing, commenting. It's about that flow.
That's right. And so that reminds us of one of the 7 C's of digital career literacy, which is connect. And here's a couple of examples of messages that I've sent or have been sent to me in LinkedIn. And they are examples of people reaching out to me, sometimes for the first time. This is the first communication that we've had based on what they've noticed about me on LinkedIn or some interaction that we've had. So there's one there. I noticed that we cross interests around career development and the like on LinkedIn. I thought it might be good to catch up at some stage. A week later, I was having a beer with that guy, and we were talking about our profession, but we were also talking about being young fathers. We were talking about being, living in Melbourne when we don't actually come from here. We were talking about studying graduate degrees. There was so much going on there, and it started from liking and commenting and noticing what the other person is posting on LinkedIn.
It comes back to that notion of being a human and a kind of a whole person, and the idea, I guess, of our work and our career interests not being separate from who we are.
Yeah, I don't like it when people talk about the online space and the real space as if they're entirely different things.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, if I'm on my phone on the tram on Facebook, I'm present. I'm in a place. I'm alive and I'm breathing.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that I'm using a particular way of communicating with people.
Yeah.
It's not like there's some other reality out there.
No, they're complementary, and I suppose it's about the way we work together and our aims crossing over and not working in isolation in either domain.
So I'm a big fan of being very strategic and using LinkedIn to its full potential, but at the end of the day, if you don't actually do anything with those relationships, I don't really see what the point is. If you're going to engage on LinkedIn, it involves engaging in real life as well, and that sometimes means taking that step of reaching out and offering someone a cup of coffee, simply because you noticed that they liked an article that you liked. And I think in the modern age we're becoming more comfortable with that. Maybe in years past it was a sort of a bit awkward, but I think that now that social media is normalising and becoming part of our everyday sort of life, it's more acceptable just to sort of say, hey, I noticed you online. The thing with LinkedIn is that sometimes people feel that it's a bit like they talk about stalking or looking at people's personal information, but we have to remember that everybody's put things on there with the intention. They've done it voluntarily, they've done it intentionally for the purpose of people looking at it. So there's nothing wrong with observing what people are putting there and saying, hey, I enjoy that, I appreciate it, let's actually get together and talk about it.
And that friendly tone really comes through in these messages that we've got up on the screen.
Yeah, these aren't business
the
emails.
No.
You do get pictures. You do get people trying to sell you insurance or pitch you on things. But by and large, it's quite a casual sort of thing, and you can sort of just send a hello and send a thanks and a congratulations and so on. So now that we've come offline and gone back into the everyday real life relationships, that brings us to the end of our seminar on online personal branding. A couple of key points for you to consider there.
Take ownership of your branding. Do it your way.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, we've described a range of ways that people can do it, but what it really comes down to is that you need to think about it, you need to make decisions about it.
And be purposeful in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a couple of recommended resources. Two of them come directly from LinkedIn. The first is pitched mostly at undergraduate students, but it's so much of it is relevant to anybody, so it's really important to have a look at that. And then the next one it's more about marketing and sales professionals, but again, really relevant, really useful information for anybody. And then the final link is to a book that's just been published in the last few months by Tristram Hooley and Jim Bright.
And they're both sort of career gurus, one from the UK and one local.
Yeah, one from right here in Australia. So Tristram, as we mentioned, he's the sort of online careers, social media kind of guy at the moment. Jim Bright's famous for the chaos theory of careers, which I don't know if has been mentioned in previous workshops.
Yes, it has, yeah.
Very engaging writers, very engaging people in general. And so they've just released a very, it's very readable, but it's also academically sound. It's based on evidence and best practice in terms of getting a job online, which it should just be called job hunting now because it's
That's
online, full stop, isn't it?
Mm. Thanks for tuning in today. Hopefully Michael and I have given you some useful ideas and information on developing your career identity, your adaptability and your capital, online and also beyond, in a way that's authentic and right for you.